Welcome back, and this is a kind of a strange video because this is a re-edit and a re-upload in a way. I never did something like that before, but I did a older Bond movies ranked video series like 2 years ago, a 3-part series. Part 1 was the worst Bond movies, then part 2 was the mid-tier, and my top 10 favorite Bond movies was part 3. But now all of a sudden, after 2 years of being online, some parts of the videos have been blocked by YouTube, and the video therefore isn't shown anymore because of the use of the Aha song, The Living Daylights. So it was blocked because the copyright holder decided that that's not okay, that I used that song in the background, which is a pity because it's my favorite Bond title song. That was the reason why it was so prominently in the videos. So I had to re-edit some of the stuff, and I decided to re-edit it as one video, not like the free video series it used to be when it was online for the last couple of years. So it's now one long video, and I deleted all the parts that had the Living Daylights in the background, which is first and foremost when I'm talking about my number one favorite Bond movie of all time. So enjoy this video, this kind of strange amalgamation of a video. This is me in 2025, and other parts of the video will be from, I don't know, 2023 or something. And in the past 2 years a couple of things have happened, and the most interesting thing as I'm recording this now was that Denis Villeneuve has been announced as the director of the forthcoming movie or movies, which I think is awesome because I'm a kind of a fan of Denis Villeneuve. I love all the movies, basically all the movies I've seen of his I do love, and I think of all the candidates that were in the running, that's the best choice for me, for my taste. I also prefer him even to Christopher Nolan and anyone else that was in the running for the gig. So now enjoy, after this preamble, enjoy the video, and like I said, will be a strange kind of cut, but I'm doing it to omit copyright infringement, basically. Thank you very much. Welcome back with more experience. Today's video is the start of my ranking of the Bond movies, the official 25 Eon production Bond movies. If you're familiar with my channel, I've once made a Bond related video so far. First and foremost, this is a channel about music, at least so far. Who knows what the future will bring, but I think I will always be more of a music focused channel. But I really love the Bond movies. As I said, I ranked the title songs, and during that video where I ranked the title songs, I already suggested that maybe one day I will do the big one of the Bond movie ranking videos, which is ranking the films. My least favorite Bond movie is a movie that in recent years had a kind of a renaissance, especially with younger people. It was financially one of the biggest flops, if not the biggest flop of the series. It's 1989's License to Kill, the second movie with Timothy Dalton, directed by John Glenn, which is one of my favorite Bond directors. He made some of my favorite Bond movies, but this is my least favorite Bond movie, and for exactly reasons why it has that kind of renaissance. I think that's what I don't like, what people who suddenly love this movie always go on about, that it's Bond kicking ass, Bond going rogue. This is more like a typical late 80s Hollywood American action gangster kind of movie with the villain, of course, is a Latin American drug lord, and it's really about, it's also the most violent movie in the series. Typical explosions and shootout kind of movie. I think the best Bond movies are great hangout movies where you're hanging out with, you wouldn't necessarily in the real world be in his shoes with all that danger, but as an escapist movie, the best of the movies are really like imagining being in a wonderful place, doing wonderful things. But this is a very bleak, and it has a bit of a almost TV movie look. It doesn't have that glamour of my favorite Bond movies. So 25 is License to Kill. 24 is The World Is Not Enough. This is also a movie that in these kind of rankings many Bond fans really seem to connect with. It's from 1999, starring Pierce Brosnan, of course. I really like Pierce Brosnan and his portrayal of Bond, but I don't think he had, with one exception, he didn't really have great movies. And as I said with License to Kill, this is also something that has a bit of a TV action movie, a bit of a cheap look, but this time it's the late 90s and not the late 80s. It has a late 90s aesthetic, and since I was a teenager at that time, so this is a time that isn't really glamorous or exotic. It's a very familiar kind of time and style of everything, and I don't think that the story doesn't do much for me. The story, usually I'm a kind of a fan of Sophie Marceau and of Robert Carlyle, who are the villains in that movie, but the characters aren't written well. It's a bit soap opera, which is also a very 90s kind of thing. And as a popcorn, again, it's a kind of an action movie more than an espionage intrigue movie. And as a popcorn action movie from the late 90s, it's okay, I think, but it's not a great entry in the Bond series, I would say. Number 23, and this hurts because it's one of my favorite times. The era is an era that is very dear to me in many aspects, and the title track is written and performed by one of my biggest idols. Like 50% of this channel in one way or another is focused on him, Paul McCartney. Title track is also the title of the film, Live and Let Die, performed by Paul McCartney and Wings. And I really loved the song, of course. Who doesn't? You don't even have to be a Paul McCartney fan to really think that this is a great song. But the rest of the movie is really very boring. It's a low stake movie. A complaint with License to Kill and The World Is Not Enough that it's too much of an action film, that it's almost tasteless, the kind of explosions they went for all the time. But this time it's not enough action, I would say. It's really very cheap looking, low stake movie. I guess it's because it's the first movie with Roger Moore, and after the at least commercial disaster of On Her Majesty's Secret Service with Lazenby 4 years before that. I think they want to play it safe and keep the budget restrained, so that if it's not the big success that it eventually would be, that they wouldn't have burned too much money, and it shows. It's as I said, the time 1973 is a time that I really love in pop culture, and also blaxploitation, which this movie is kind of doing in its own way. I really love the vibe of those kind of movies like Shaft or Superfly, and also lesser known ones. I really like that, but again, it's not what I like my Bond to be, what I like James Bond to be doing. And Roger Moore, which is one of my favorite Bond actors, isn't yet really comfortable in the role. The weight of the legendary Sean Connery weighs heavily on him. He tries to do things different in this movie. There isn't yet the shaken not stirred martini. He smokes cigars instead of cigarettes, so he really wants to make his own portrayal of Bond, but he doesn't really own it. Once Roger Moore got more comfortable with the tropes that Sean Connery set in the 60s, with his third movie, Roger Moore was totally owned the part. But these are like his early, dipping the toe in the water, and it doesn't really work for me. Number 22, probably the most ridiculed Bond movie of all time, and strictly objectively speaking, this is probably the worst Bond movie in terms of filmmaking and aesthetic and everything. It's 2002's Die Another Day, the last Brosnan movie. this is one of those movies that are so bad that they're entertaining. It's a funny movie. If you don't take it too serious, it's very, very campy. It's just a strange thing, since the first third of the movie at least tries to be an edgy espionage thriller with Pierce Brosnan getting captured by the North Koreans, and it's really, you think in the first 20-30 minutes you think, oh, this is going to be a gritty Bond movie, a good gritty Bond movie, but then it falls off a cliff, and the second and the third of the movie are ridiculously bad. So it's a movie that doesn't really know what it wants to be, since the first third is a totally different kind of feel. It's hilarious. So it's not number 25, because at least it has some strange entertainment value that the first three entries in my list didn't have, which are more the boring ones for me. 21. It's also a bit of a guilty pleasure, some would say at least. A View to a Kill from 1985, the last Roger Moore movie. And it's again a movie that doesn't really know what it wants to be. It's often these last entries of an actor. Die Another Day was Brosnan's last, and now Moore's last. Again, the first half takes it a bit more serious, if you can say it about this movie, with some espionage, and then in France, those are probably the best parts of the movie. But again, the second half with Christopher Walken and Grace Jones, which, I like Grace Jones as a pop culture icon. I don't think she's a good actress. And Christopher Walken, of course, is a brilliant actor, but this is such a strange villain pair. And once the film goes to America, it goes downhill. Not as bad as License to Kill, but again it tries to be more like an 80s Hollywood action movie. And also a bit strange is the title track by Duran Duran, which is such a cool, modern sounding, edgy, up-tempo song, great song. But then the movie, it doesn't really fit with the movie. The movies prior to that, they always had those lush, elegant slow ballads, and these kind of songs would have fitted, all these songs from Moonraker onwards would have fitted much more with the tone of A View to a Kill, whereas A View to a Kill, the song by Duran Duran, would have fitted much better with like Octopus or some of those movies that had those kinds of ballads. So again, movie doesn't know what it wants to be. Number 20. Possibly the most controversial thing yet on my list, because it's a beloved movie by many. It's 4 Years Only from 1981, Roger Moore. It's a good spy thriller, but I don't think it's as good as some people would like it to be. It has some things that don't really add up for me, some boring moments also, where Roger Moore is speaking out against revenge as a motive. Is a bit far-fetched if you've seen any of the other movies. It has some beautiful locations, but the way they are filmed, it has some, not always, but sometimes a bit of a grey, cheap look to it, which is a strange thing with the John Glenn movies. All the 80s Bonds were directed by John Glenn, and he had a couple of hits and a couple of misses, and this goes especially for the cinematography. Because some of his movies are amongst the most beautiful looking Bond movies, and some, like 4 Years Only, are a bit more on the dull side. So I don't know why there are these divergences in his body of Bond work. And number 19, even more controversial. It's a movie that often gets compared to 4 Years Only. It's the 60s equivalent of 4 Years Only. It's From Russia with Love from 1963, the second Bond movie. Sean Connery's favorite Bond movie, and especially for the more hardcore Bond fans, it's one of the best, because this is one of those who's pretty close to the novelization by Ian Fleming, and that's why it's the best of the bad ones. From Russia with Love isn't really a bad movie. From now on, we're talking about at least very good movies, I would say. But I think it's a bit of a second-rate Hitchcock movie. Third act doesn't work, after the train sequences. That would have been a good point to round it up, or at least have some great final scene after that if you think you need one more scene after that too. But the kind of 30 minutes tacked on after the train stuff, very pointless. This is like, oh, we have to have some action scenes in our Bond movie so that the audience is happy, and for the time possibly those explosions with the boat chase were like, wow, big action spectacle, but this is a movie that goes on a bit too long. So with a different edit of that movie, a bit trimmed version at least of the third act, this would be a great spy thriller, I would say. But that third act, like in some of the movies I've already talked about, and some of the forthcoming as well, is often a bit of a problem for the Bond movies. And this is an early example for that. But now we are at number 18. And that's Spectre from 2015. Daniel Craig wanted this to be his last Bond movie, but I think even he thought after watching the final thing that he has to do another one, a very last Bond appearance, because you can't go out with such a stupid movie. It has its moments, but the whole Blofeld is his brother thing is one of the most stupid ideas anyone ever had. It has consequences that even affect No Time to Die, the movie after that. They never should have made this that way. And also the color grading of that movie, those yellowish tones, it's so strange. It always puts you out of the movie experience. What I do have to say in its defense, it's one of the first on this list that really has this elegance and this glam factor that I like about Bond movies. Cinematography, all in all, is pretty good. Number 70, 1979's Moonraker, very divisive film amongst Bond fans. It's one of the most entertaining movies, also one of the most best looking, very cinematic looking film with beautiful locations. So there's a lot to like about that movie. Directed by Louis Gilbert, who also directed You Only Live Twice and The Spy Who Loved Me, and one could say he made the same movie 3 times over and over again, and so that can be said against him, that it's always basically the same plot. But his movies get bigger and bigger, and Moonraker is the biggest of them all. So maybe in this, if you're here for the spectacle, it's the best of his trilogy. Some call it the monorail trilogy because his movies are usually the ones with the big villain layers where they often have monorails. It's a spectacularly looking movie, but very silly plot, of course, and the whole Jaws becoming a good guy thing is very strange, very 70s, I would say. I love the 70s. I love the strangeness of 70s movies in general. So there's lots of things to like for me about it, but the story is a joke. Number 16, A Quantum of Solace. This is where here the story is definitely not a joke. It's a movie that takes itself very serious, maybe almost too serious for my taste, and the story could be really from the real world. The villain wants to make profit with water in I think Bolivia or some place like in a place where water is a rare commodity. So this is really kind of a realistic scenario in this world, whereas Moonraker is very fantastical and science fiction, of course, or as Mr. Broccoli called it, science fact. But Quantum of Solace, there's not much outrageousness in it. It tries to be realistic, but of course it's just that Hollywood realism that's not realistic at all. In fact, I think Bond movies also need some lightness in them, and this is what this movie is lacking. Number 15 is the very first Bond movie from 1962, Dr. No. Great movie, detective story, spy movie, lots of espionage, next to From Russia with Love and Casino Royale, probably the one that's closest to Ian Fleming's novels. And it's a great introduction to Sean Connery, not just to Sean Connery as Bond, but this was his breakthrough role. He became not just a Hollywood star, but a 20th century icon with that. And it's a great performance by him. Of course, Ursula Andress, the quintessential first Bond girl, really set a template here. The villain is great. So all in all, it's a very good movie. It's not higher because they haven't yet figured out some of the recurring tropes that make Bond movies, like the big dramatic title song, gadgets and things like that aren't yet there, but it's more than a promising start for the series. Number 14, Tomorrow Never Dies. So now this is really the mid-tier. This is like the, I wouldn't say most average Bond movie, because when it's number 14 in this ranking, I'm a huge Bond fan. Of course, I really really like that movie. But compared to the others, this is more vanilla, more medium. It doesn't get more vanilla, more medium, so to speak. It's the second Pierce Brosnan movie. He's really good in it. But it's again with some of the lower ranking movies. I don't particularly like the Bond movies that are going too much for that Hollywood action blockbuster thing. The plot moves so fast. It's edited at a frantic pace. And I like those more calm Bond moments too, where you enjoy the scenery and beautiful exotic locations, beautiful, sometimes exotic women. Tomorrow Never Dies isn't really that kind of movie, but I think it's pretty good. 13, You Only Live Twice. 1967, Sean Connery. That's probably the most iconic movie in a way that in the pop cultural memory, it ingrained itself in the pop cultural memory. It's the Bond movie that gets spoofed the most, like Austin Powers. This is the first Louis Gilbert film. I've talked about him a few minutes ago. This is the first one with those big villain layers and fantastical villain plots to hold the world at ransom. And yeah, it's a great movie. One thing, I love the Japan location, but what I don't like about the movie is that, I guess almost 90% of the movie take place in that Japan locations, and I like to have some variation in my Bond movies. I like the travel log aspect of Bond very much, and Japan looks beautiful in that movie, but I would have preferred the movie to mix it up with other locations as well, as the previous movies did brilliantly. Number 12, The Man with the Golden Gun, 1974, Roger Moore, directed by Guy Hamilton, who also directed, for example, Goldfinger, but also Diamonds Are Forever and Live and Let Die, and it's pretty good. Christopher Lee as Scaramanga is one of the, I would say, my top 5, if not top 3 favorite villains in the whole history of Bond. I'm also one of the people in a minority here, I think, who really likes Britt Eklund's performance as Agent Goodnight. I think she's very funny. I really like her. I think she has lots of charm in it. I also like the location, Southeast Asia. It's a great, kind of underrated Bond movie. The number 11, slightly missing out the top 10. Very divisive movie, the most recent Bond movie, No Time to Die from 2020. It has all the ingredients to be a fantastic, great Bond movie. I think the first 2/3 of that movie are almost perfect. If the third would be as good as the first 2/3, it would be a top 10, maybe even top 5 Bond movie for me. It really kind of falls off a cliff with its third act. I think they had to do lots of reshoots. It doesn't seem very coherent. The villain's plot seems strange. I think it had to do a lot with COVID and the pandemic. I suppose that, my theory, and not just but also my theory, is that the villain was initially planned or designed to be Dr. No, that it was a kind of a remake of Dr. No, No Time to Die and his plan and his lair. It's lots of resemblance from that movie, and I think that his the chemical weapon that he would use or wants to use in that movie initially was a kind of a virus, and due to COVID and the pandemic, they changed that, and after they changed so much of it, didn't make much sense anymore after all those script rewrites. I suppose, it's just a theory. But the first two-thirds are flawless, breathtakingly spectacular, and I also liked, the very end with Bond dying. I'm kind of okay with it. I just, I think the things that lead up to it, these 30 minutes before he dies, they don't work for me. I already suspected that he's going to die in the movie, so I was one of the few who thought that this would be very likely. Because of the title song. The title song was released a year before the movie, so we had lots of time to think about what this means. And I thought from the tone of the song, this could be a hint that he's not going to make it, and also with Daniel Craig being so tired of the role and wanting to exit the role for such a long time. So I think, to me, it seemed plausible that Daniel Craig probably wanted this kind of end to make it final. But yeah, it's a great movie and would be a top 10 movie if they had a different third act. The dying part is okay, as I said, but the things that lead up to it. And I think they probably had that better third act, but had to rewrite and reshoot it. But still, brilliant movie, No Time to Die. It's number 10, On Her Majesty's Secret Service from 1969, directed by Peter Hunt, with George Lazenby in the lead role. When I was growing up in the 80s, early 90s, this was still kind of the black sheep James Bond, the one time James Bond, George Lazenby. So when my father first showed me that movie, when like I said, in the late 80s, early 90s, it must have been, I was used to Sean Connery's and Roger Moore's portrayal, and my father, of course, from this old generation, also was like, it's not as good as the Connery Bonds, Lazenby's Wooden, all those things that you heard all the time. But then when I didn't have much expectations after that. So when I watched it, I was like, it's not that bad at all. Maybe Lazenby is not as charismatic as Sean Connery, but who is as charismatic as Sean Connery? So with that low expectations, I was pleasantly surprised. And I still, my opinion hasn't really changed about it. It's one of my 10 favorite James Bond movies. It has its flaws. There are people, it has shifted so much, the opinion of it, that some people say it's the best or one of the 2 or 3 best Bond movies. I wouldn't go that far, because there are still some flaws in it. The frantic jump cuts that were always a thing in the 60s Bond, they are dialed up to 11 in that movie, very, very crazy jump cuts, but it's also a bit of a psychedelic late 60s movie, so it works, but maybe it's a bit too much, but it gives it its own character, and I think the love montage, when he and Diana Rigg are prancing around in love. The song that's playing in the background there, We Have All the Time in the World by Louis Armstrong, is one of my favorite Bond songs or songs. But I think it doesn't really fit with the tone of Bond movies, even that movie, and it's a bit out of place, I think, that sequence. But the rest of the movie is almost a masterpiece, or in terms of Bond movies, a masterpiece. Peter Hunt's direction, the cinematography is brilliant. The story, Ian Fleming's On Her Majesty's Secret Service story is fantastic, and also this time also executed very authentically, in the vibe of the book. So it's a great Bond movie, and it's a top 10 Bond movie for me. Number 9, now maybe the most controversial pick on the complete list. It's the movie after On Her Majesty's Secret Service. On Her Majesty's Secret Service was kind of a flop. It still was a big success worldwide, but compared to the Connery movies before that. It was considered a flop by Eon Productions, so they thought we have to get back the winning team. Shirley Bassey sings the title song. Sean Connery was paid a record high fee to get back to the role that he by that point really hated, the role of James Bond. And Guy Hamilton, the one who directed Goldfinger, is also back in the director's chair. So it's a bit of the comeback of the Goldfinger team, and almost everyone thinks it can't hold a candle to Goldfinger. And of course, I also rank Goldfinger, as you will see, a bit higher than this. But Diamonds Are Forever, we're talking about 1971's Diamonds Are Forever, I think it's one of the most underrated Bond movies. I think people get it wrong, especially nowadays when On Her Majesty's Secret Service has redeemed itself so much. People can't see it in the context of the time, that they thought we have to bring back some lightness, lightheartedness, sense of humor. They really had to analyze what went wrong with the previous movie. So they tried to make this a fun, escapist kind of Bond movie, and I love the Bond movies. I love Bond movies that are like that. I like the ones with the funny quips. I also like the serious ones like On Her Majesty's Secret Service. But this is such a fun romp. It's the one with the wittiest dialogue, very spunky. Jill St. John as Tiffany Case is one of my favorite Bond girls. She brings so much fun to the movie. Fun, that's the word that I associate with that movie. Of course, you can't take it very seriously. It's the one with the campy Blofeld, portrayed by Charles Gray. And you could see that lots of the budget went into paying Sean Connery, because the climax falls a bit short. I think they couldn't really film everything that they had planned because they ran out of money, and it shows. It has a bit of that it has a sort of a sleaziness, cheapness to it, like all the Guy Hamilton movies from the 70s. But this is my favorite of his 70s Bond movies. And as I said with my Live and Let Die review, I usually like that early 70s sleaziness and greasiness, and with Live and Let Die I never could connect, but I always love Diamonds Are Forever. Number 8, GoldenEye, Pierce Brosnan, 1995. Fantastic movie. This is Martin Campbell directed, who's one of the, I would say, 2 or 3 most important and best, my favorite Bond directors. He only had 2 movies, but both were really masterpieces. Now we are, Diamonds Are Forever, I can see it is not really a masterpiece, but I think from now on we're talking about Bond masterpieces, 10 out of 10 movies, almost flawless movies. GoldenEye is one of those kind of almost flawless movies. Maybe it's a bit too flawless for me, and that's why it's not in the top 7, because it feels like checking off boxes. We have to have this, we have to have that. It's a bit of a 90s thing. 90s were one of the first decades in Hollywood or in pop culture, one could say, that were just like sampling the best bits of the past, and this movie is like a collage of all the best bits of Bond movies from the past, and Pierce Brosnan's portrayal as Bond is also a bit like a sample, sampling the best bits of Connery, of Moore, of Dalton, of course. A few hours later, the battery was empty and I had to recharge, but now I'm back. And where was I? I think, GoldenEye. Was it that? I wanted to say sometimes the sum is greater than the single parts. In this case, I think the single parts are all great, but the sum of the movie doesn't really move me as much as the next 7 will. But that's probably just a personal thing. But I think those single parts, like the henchman, great henchmen and henchwomen, great Bond girl, great Bond, Brosnan, great debut, great title song by Tina Turner, great locations, exotic locations, great film. It's like I said, like boxes that are being checked, that Bond fans are wishing for. But maybe it's a bit too generic at the end, which is something you could say about all the Brosnan Bonds. But it's the best. It's by far the best. Brosnan Bond movie. Number 7, now the most classic, the most iconic Bond movie, the one that finally got all the tropes right. In the first 2 movies, Dr. No and From Russia with Love, they just were, discovering what's working, what's not working. And Goldfinger, the third one, that was really the big milestone, maybe the first big action blockbuster movie ever. And yeah, it's a fantastic movie. Sometimes when you're really a Bond fan and you love older movies and you also love maybe the more eccentric movies, you have a soft spot for the more eccentric movies, you sometimes tend to forget about the greatness of Goldfinger. But that's a fantastic movie. I would say that's the father's movie, for my generation. That's the movie that, I was born in the early 80s, my father was born in the late 50s, so he was young when Goldfinger came out, and for him, and I think for many people of this generation, this was like the template, the ultimate Bond movie that every new Bond movie will be compared to, and yeah, it's great, Goldfinger. Number 6, Skyfall, the third Daniel Craig movie. What Goldfinger was for Sean Connery, I would say Skyfall was for Daniel Craig. That's the one that made him and his portrayal of Bond iconic. It's also a bit like with Goldfinger, a movie that checks all the boxes. It's the first from the rebooted Craig movies that has Q. It's not the first that has the DB5 Aston Martin. I think that car was also in Casino Royale, but this is the first time it really, it's center stage. It's the Bond car really in that movie, and lots of typical Bond tropes are now adjusted to the modern times, and yeah, it's a fantastic movie, and I think it's more, like GoldenEye said it's like a movie that checks boxes, but this time, for my taste, it does it in a more exciting way. The camera work, the cinematography is, I don't think there's a better Bond movie in terms of that. Sam Mendes' direction is awesome. If Spectre would have been better than it turned out, we would talk about Sam Mendes as one of the top 3 best Bond directors. But as it turned out, he has one great masterpiece of a Bond movie and one, Spectre, not so good Bond movie after all. But Skyfall is a brilliant movie. I love it. Number 5, now the top 5, now from now on only movies that are really very close to my heart. All 10 movies in the top 10 I would say are extremely rewatchable, very rewatchable movies, movies you can watch once a year, and especially for the top 5. Number 5 is 1977's The Spy Who Loved Me, Roger Moore, directed by Louis Gilbert. So this is the second of the 3 spectacular, I said it before, Louis Gilbert was always the guy for the big spectacle Bond movies, and his second is probably the best. It's not yet as silly as the next one, Moonraker. It's a bit more confident than the first one, You Only Live Twice, and so it's the sweet spot of the Monorail trilogy. I've talked about it in the previous video. With a better villain's plot and a better villain, it would probably be a top 3 movie for me. That's the only thing that falls a bit short. Kurt Jürgens is a great actor. I've seen him in many movies. It's not his fault, but the character wasn't written well. His vision for the world, that's very silly. That's already Moonraker territory here, the villain's motivation. But the camera work is great. The stunts, like in the pre-title sequence, is great. I also like the score by Marvin Hamlisch. I think many people are not too fond of it. I think from the non-John Barry scores, it's one of my favorites. The locations are great. The Lotus is probably my favorite Bond car. I prefer it to the Aston Martins and clearly to the BMWs and everything else that was. This is my favorite Bond car. Again, very silly that it's also a submarine, but I love that car, the way it looks. Barbara Bach, one of my favorite Bond girls. Maybe also because I'm such a big Beatle fan, and she's of course Mrs. Ringo Starr. Yeah, she's great in it. I also, I don't like the villain's motivation, but I like her motivation. I like the character. I like how she's written, and General Gogol, and that she's a KGB agent and that they have to work together, KGB and the MI6 in that movie. That's an interesting concept, I would say. It was like around the end of the hippie era and was also the start of the disco era. Very interesting, also pop culturally very interesting time, and that West and East are working together against someone who's clearly evil. There's a bit of that vibe from the hippie era, I would say, that it's people working together for the greater good. I really like that sentiment. Number 4, Casino Royale, Daniel Craig's debut movie. It's the other Martin Campbell movie next to GoldenEye, and it's his, GoldenEye is also considered a masterpiece of a Bond movie, but this undoubtedly is his biggest achievement, his greatest masterpiece. From the movie making point of view, it's probably the best of the series. The way it's directed, the way it's filmed, stunts, again the pre-title sequence when he's jumping off the crane and things like that. That's incredible. And yeah, it's a good introduction to that new rebooted Bond. To this time we're doing things differently. The message gets communicated quite clearly, and fantastic Bond girl, also fantastic villain. Let's say the Daniel Craig movies had 2 of the best villains ever in Bond history. Javier Bardem and Mads Mikkelsen in Skyfall and now in Casino Royale. 2 of the, I would say, top 10 if not top 5 all-time villains, and Bond girl played by Eva Green, probably a top 5 Bond girl for me. And yeah, it's a fantastic movie with a great look and a great feel. Number 3, now the upper echelon, Thunderball from 1965. This is the Bond hangout, the Bond lifestyle movie for me. It's also one of my earliest childhood memories of a movie that I watched and still can remember. I must have been around 6 or 7 years of age. So when you're watching something like that at that age, it's even more impressive. It defines you. In some way, it defines what kind of women I'm attracted to, probably, and what kind of exotic places in the world I would love to visit. And yeah, it's a fantastic movie in the way it looks and pulls you into that world, into that dangerous but exciting world. I love the music, I love the score, the title song, I love the Bahamas locations. I think Fiona Volpe is one of the most charismatic women in the Bond franchise. Sean Connery was never better in the role. I think it's his best portrayal as Bond. I think some people, especially younger generations, say it's a boring movie, that hangout aspect of it. Also the scenes underwater, but I love the underwater stuff. And I love that the movie takes its time, to show you around, to really immerse you into that world. Not just one of my favorite Bond movies, one of my favorite 60s movies, and one of my favorite movies, let's face it. Number 2, my favorite Roger Moore movie, 1983's Octopussy. Clear winner, in my opinion, against Never Say Never Again, which came out in the same year, the non-official Bond movie with Sean Connery. Never Say Never Again, one of my least favorite movies, and this my second favorite in this ranking. This is the movie, like GoldenEye, I said with GoldenEye, a movie that checks all the boxes, but in this case also the sum works for me. It has everything. It has a breathtakingly spectacular pre-title sequence. Some people don't like the title song. I really love the title song. When I ranked the title songs, it was, I think, my number 7 favorite Bond title song. The score, all in all, I think it's also my second favorite score by John Barry. We have to wait for the next movie to find out what my favorite John Barry score is. I like the villains, all of them. Oromov, Khan, like the Bond girls. I really like the Bond girls. I think Maud Adams is much better in this movie than in The Man with the Golden Gun, where she played a different character. I love the countries that he's visiting in that movie. Cuba. They didn't really film it in Cuba, but it's supposed to be Cuba. And of course, India. I like the the sidekick in the tennis playing sidekick in India. He has a funny, great, charismatic energy. I think he was really a tennis player. He wasn't really a professor. He wasn't an actor. In the first place, he was a tennis star of the early '80s from India. Great. Forgot his name. Sorry. Roger Moore. It's his best portrayal as Bond. He's at such ease with the role by that point. It's his 6 or 7 movies, and unlike A View to a Kill from 2 years later, they really pull off this the seasoned agent thing. That he's not a young agent anymore. Never was. He was like 45 in 1973 with his first movie, but now that he's really an experienced, seasoned agent, and he pulls it off quite greatly in that movie. I think one of the disconnects with A View to a Kill was that he had a facelifting just before they started filming that film, so he looks a bit odd, But without the facelift, he's really I think he's a much more attractive older guy in Octopussy than in as the post facelift 1985 Roger Moore, I have to say. The only thing that probably prevents it from being number one is Q. I think it's a bit silly. It's the first time when Q becomes a comedy relief character in the Bond franchise. Sometimes they do it better, and sometimes, like in this case, and much more so in License to Kill, it's really not working for me. It puts you out of the of the grittiness, of the tension, of the thrill of the movie when all of a sudden Q is like this funny mad scientist uncle guy. That doesn't work for me. But the rest of the movie is almost perfect. And my number one movie, this is now me from 2025 talking again, since parts of what I'm going to tell you now have been blocked by YouTube before because of the use of the Living Daylights song. My number one movie is the Living Daylights. Maybe next to the placement of Diamonds Are Forever, this is the most controversial thing in my video. This is the black sheep Bond. On Her Majesty's Secret Service has now redeemed itself, but now it's Deep Rightful is so kind of a masterpiece. But the Living Daylights, usually, no one really talks about the Living Daylights. 1987, Timothy Dalton, directed like Octopussy by John Glenn. So my top two favorite Bond movies were both directed by the same guy. But on the other hand, he also directed my least favorite Bond, so what does this tell you? But yeah, great director for Bond movies, in my opinion, all in all. And what to say about that movie? Fantastic locations, cinematography is fantastic, the score is fantastic. It's my favorite score of all the Bonds. It's the last John Barry score. He also has a cameo in the end of the movie, which is kind of moving if you're a fan of John Barry like myself. The title track, which I can't play, is my favorite title track of all the Bond songs. Then Carla Mariam Davo is my second favorite Bond girl of all time. Tiffany Case, St. Joan from Diamonds Are Forever is my favorite Bond girl. And I really like Timothy Dalton and his portrayal. I didn't really like his portrayal in License to Kill, where it's a bit too tense for me. But in Living Daylights, he's perfect. I think that's the best Bond performance ever, by an actor in a Bond movie as Bond. People always say he's not good at the comedic stuff, but I disagree. He did lots of comedies throughout his career, and usually he's great in it. And in Living Daylights, there are some, Roger Moore kind of lines still, and I think he's very dry in his delivery, but it's great. And the serious stuff is also, first and foremost, he's really great in the serious stuff. And this is a serious Bond movie in a way. The script is a great mixture of sense of humor and lightness, but also a heavy espionage, very Fleming-like story. Cold War story is one of the few in the movies that is really a Cold War story, and it's a complex script, something that can go wrong and sometimes did go wrong in Bond movies, like Spectre, for example. But this complex script, it works, you know, first of all because the acting is so good, also the supporting cast is great, the direction by John Glenn is really at its peak. Spectacular action sequences, especially the pre-title sequence. Then also the countries he's visiting. One of those countries is my country and my city. I'm here in Vienna in Austria. And the funny thing is that the places that are supposed to be Czechoslovakia, Bratislava, they were also filmed in Vienna. They were, people from Vienna know this, but they couldn't obviously they couldn't film during the Cold War. They couldn't film in Slovakia as Slovakia, so they just went for the more grubby parts of Vienna, and the more iconic parts of Vienna are Vienna, and the more rundown parts of Vienna are supposed to be Bratislava, which I find funny. And I think it's done greatly. It really looks like it's two different cities. They filmed this really brilliantly. Also, the other locations in the movie, I do like them all, especially the England stuff. It's one of my favorite England scenes of the whole Bond series, when they're in this estate in the countryside where General Koskov gets abducted. Not really abducted because it's a plot. But those are all great scenes, and it's a clever movie. It's a very entertaining movie, and it's one of my favorite action-adventure movies of all time. So that was my ranking of all the Bond movies. Let me know what you think about it and about my strange choices. And yeah, thank you very much for watching. Until next time, goodbye.